Uh, Good evening and welcome to this evening's information overview of the FY20 town budget. This particular presentation was originally envisioned as a session here at the town hall. We have a very sparse crowd tonight, so actually the format for this is a live stream for any of you out tuned into Medfield TV who might be interested in getting some information about the town budget. So I hope you're out there. I recognize there's a Bruins game that we're competing with, and it's very clear there are a number of other meetings here in town that have people tied up. So I hope somebody's out there to hear this. What I'd like to do is take a little bit of time to go through some highlights of the town budget. The prime purpose here is to help you be sure that you understand the town budget, what you're going to be looking at on Monday night when you come to the town meeting. If you're like me, over the years, for one thing, I didn't really fully understand the town budget. When it showed up in the warrant report, it was a big, long list of a lot of budget items. There usually were a couple of people in the room who seemed to have enough knowledge of the budget to be able to ask intelligent questions about particular items. But oftentimes I'd look at the full budget and I wasn't smart enough to see anything that was out of whack. I just kind of looked at it and reacted to it. The other thing is that when you go to the town meeting, if you do have questions, especially about something like the budget, oftentimes I found at least that my questions, I had several questions, and it just wasn't appropriate to try to slow down the town meeting to go through a whole list of questions. So our hope tonight is to give all of you some better sense of what the budget is all about. And in this presentation, I have a little bit of background information to give you on past budgets and past trends that might help shed a little bit of light and give you a little more perspective on why the budget you're going to be seeing on Monday night is what it is. So we have a few objectives for tonight. One is to give you a general context for understanding the budget. The second is to give you a high-level explanation of what the budget is in a way that I hope you'll find intuitive. And had any of you shown up here tonight and were in the audience, you would have had a chance to ask questions. But unfortunately, except for a couple of folks here from the finance team, it's a pretty quiet room here for this presentation. To start with, I'd like to introduce a basic framework for how to understand the town budget. The background on this came about last year. Some of you may have attended the information sessions that we conducted between the town meeting and the election to confirm the overrides that were passed at town meeting. In getting prepared for that information session, one of the challenges was to try to figure out how to explain the entire budget to people in a relatively short amount of time in a way that would be easy for them to understand. And the framework that I'm going to introduce here tonight is basically the framework that I used last year that seemed to be very well received. I'll get into this a little bit later, but after having developed that framework, I then ran across some ideas about ways that towns are going about managing the preparation of their budgets, and I'll talk a little more about how that fits into this framework when we get there. So to think about the framework, one of the important things to keep in mind is that not all parts of a town budget are fully up for discretionary decisions at town meeting. There are some things that the town has to spend money on and has very little option or very little choice about the matter. And one of the things that I saw last year in the difficulties that we had trying to bring a reasonable budget in without having to go to overrides is that the town was trying to find a way to manage all of that when in fact many parts of the budget are not really controllable in the short run. So to start this framework, one of the things that we recognized is that there were three components of the town budget that you can think of as being pre-specified. They're basically things that we spend money on that we have virtually no choice but to spend money on. The first of those are fixed expenditures, and I don't want to get into the details of what all those fixed expenditures are, but over the course of years, we have certain money that comes in from the state in the form of aid or in the form of other programs where we get funding. But oftentimes in the process of dealing with the state, we also pick up obligations. And so while we have money that comes in from the state, there oftentimes are specific expenses or specific money that has to be returned to the state to pay for things. So one of the examples that you might all recognize, if you're at all familiar with some of the things that have happened over the past years here in town, for instance, we don't have any choice but to pay back the loan that we took out from the state when we bought the state hospital property. So that's an automatic expenditure that's going to come out of the budget. The second item is also something that we don't have an ability to manage. Last year, this second item was the major driver for why we were in trouble in trying to bring a budget in within Prop 2.5 limits, and that's the town and school employee benefits. You could make a case, I guess, that over the long term, you could adjust the number of town and school employees, and you might have some effect on what the benefits costs for town and school employees would be. But to the extent that we have town and school employees, the benefits costs that go to cover those town and school employees are pre-specified, and we have to pay them. Last year, that was a major issue for us to manage. I'll show you a little bit later that this has actually been an issue for us over a number of years. And then finally, the third item that we don't really have a lot of choice over is our debt service. So when the town takes out bonds to fund the building, the construction of new buildings, or anything else that we take out loans for, we're obviously under an obligation to pay those back. And so we're paying debt interest and principal payments on our debt year in and year out. So that part of the budget we kind of have to live with the way it turns out. The second elements in the budget that I wanted to talk about are also effectively fixed expenditures, although they are kind of fixed because we've chosen policies that have caused them to be fixed. And they fall into two broad categories. One is the money that we set aside for our capital budgets. We certainly have some discretionary authority over whether we spend money on capital in the short run, but if we don't actually keep our capital expenditures up over the years, we'll get into a deeper and deeper hole. And right now the town is trying to dig itself out of a little bit of a hole that we're already in around capital spending, especially capital spending for the maintenance of our buildings. The second item here is the funds for special articles. Basically, any of the articles that you see in the town warrant that are not having to do with the town operating budget or the capital budgets and things like that are articles that have been submitted for the town's consideration. Some of those articles have financial requirements that go along with them. And so again, if the article is in there and if the townspeople agree to approve the article, then what we're basically doing is committing to the funding for those articles that get approved. So that's the second category. Effectively, they're fixed, but it's kind of set by policy. The third category is the ones that we care the most about, the town operating budget and the school's operating budget. And those are the two budgets that you all as taxpayers do have a degree of discretion over. The town and the school department has a degree of discretion over. Basically, those are the operating budgets on both sides that you're most familiar with. Now, to put this in context, those fixed expenditures that I first talked about represent about a quarter of the town budget. The expenditures that are set by policy represent around 5% of the town budget. And the part that we would call the discretionary budget the discretionary components of the overall town budget represent about 70%. That's the basic structure for understanding how the town structures its budget. What I want to do now is go into a couple of slides that reflect some analysis that I did several months ago and to show you some things from a historic perspective. The first question I had, goes back into February or March, was looking at those major components of the town budget, what are the pressures that we face in driving our budget? I can tell you that I went into this thinking that the pressure that we were facing was the pressure coming in from the school department to continue to grow its budget and counteracted by the pressures that the town side of the budget was under to basically make up for any excesses that the school budget growth had. I found out that that's not actually the case. That's not really what's been happening, and this came as a surprise to me. The single component of our budget over the last 10 fiscal years that has been consistently trending upward has been the town and school employee benefits category. So if there's one thing that's kept our budgets under pressure, it's the benefits costs, and as you know, healthcare costs are a big component of that, and they've been hitting everybody pretty hard. Town departments historically have represented around 18% of the total budget, and it's fluctuated a little bit up and down over the years, but basically it's over that 10-year period it's been pretty steady. Debt and principal has been something that's kind of continued to trend downward over the 10 years, but that's really a function of how much debt that we take out. So it was trending downward. We took some debt out for the highway department garage and the public safety building, which has bumped it up a little bit. It's starting to trend downward again now, and it will continue for the next couple of years. But I suspect many of you know that the Dale Street School project is on the horizon, and when that hits, all of a sudden our debt payments are going to jump up rapidly. I have Georgia Kalivas here, and I just want to check, but one of the things which I think is commendable that the town, as far as policy goes, is when we take out a 20-year bond, we don't pay it off like a mortgage that's a steady payment over the 20 years. We pay it off as a straight loan, so each year we pay the principal and interest down. So from year to year, the remaining principal on our debt goes down relatively rapidly over that 20-year period. That's a pretty prudent way and a fiscally conservative way for us to manage our debt, which is partly why that drops off quickly when we don't add debt. Vocational schools are a minor factor, and the school department, like the town departments, has remained surprisingly stable as a percentage of our overall budget for the last 10 years. Incidentally, if anyone wants to replicate this, what I did was I took the warrant reports and took the information straight out of the warrant reports over the last 10 fiscal years, and that's the numbers that I used for this. What that means is that for the FY19 numbers, those numbers do not reflect the overrides that were approved at last year's town meeting. I just didn't go there with it. I did this off the warrant reports. Water and sewer similarly has been very consistent around 3.5% of our total budget year in and year out. So that's the trend. The biggest issue here is the thing that really hits us pretty hard is town and school employee benefits. Oops. From there, I said, well, okay, here's the next thing I want to know. I think that the schools have been getting bigger and bigger at the expense of the towns, and obviously you can't do that forever unless we want to get out of the business of having town departments. So this is a complicated slide, but the only part that's really important to this is the two lines at the bottom. And this came as a complete and utter surprise to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, having been on the warrant committee for 6 years before I came on to the Board of Selectmen, I can tell you that every single year the process of getting to our budgets has been different, unpredictable, sometimes contentious, never the same. And yet when I did this split, and what I was looking here is I took everything out except for what was available for town and school spending, and I took a look at those two budgets in comparison, and I was completely floored when I discovered that over the last 10 years, we have pretty much absolutely consistently had that discretionary budget component of our budget get split 25% to the town budget and 75% to the school budget. So again, that came as a total and utter surprise to me because I thought that we were having difficulties around the balance between the town and school operating budgets, and that is not the case. Interestingly, the schools and the town budgets have grown at about the same rate. For anybody who looks at those numbers in the table and wonders how it can be that the school and the town can grow at more than 2.5% for several years, remember that there's things like new growth and there's other things beyond just the strict Prop 2.5 limit on our existing levy that contribute to the money that we have. So that helps explain that, particularly if there's other categories that are not growing or if interest and principal payments on our debt are going down. Here's where this gets interesting for me, just to, again, to place some things in context. When I got to that, and I realized that we didn't have any real competition between the schools and the town and the departments, I basically asked myself, why do we have a problem then? And I looked at something else. What I did was I took a look at what percent of the total town budget, schools and town, what percent of that total budget was paid for out of the tax levy? And this was a very important point. This was the third surprise I got from this analysis. In FY10, 10 fiscal years ago, our tax levy covered 73% of our total budget. In FY19, this year, our tax levy covers 83% of our total budget. What that means is that the money that we have, primarily the money that's been coming in from the state to supplement the revenues that we generate through our taxes, on average has been going down 1% a year over the past 10 years. And so as bad as the town and school employee benefits issue is, realizing that the state as a percentage of our budget year in and year out, has been pulling back on its direct support of the town by about 1% a year, I think actually represents an even greater explanation for why we felt the tax pressure we felt over the past several years. So for those of you out there who are basically disgruntled or frustrated with how your taxes have been going up, this doesn't change anything, but I hope it at least deepens your understanding of why that's been happening. So with that, let me just quickly walk through the overall budget to give you an idea of what we have here. This is the revenue side of the budget. So from a general revenue standpoint, we are going to be raising just under $50 million from the taxes you and the limited number of businesses that we have here in town pay. This includes a pretty modest estimate for projected new growth, but that's consistent pretty much, I think, with our history, so it's a reasonable estimate. From a non-tax revenue standpoint, which are local receipts, other funds, and the enterprise funds, we actually, in the budget here, do get a contribution from the enterprise funds to cover some of the costs of operating the town. We'll be raising about $12.8 million in that manner, and then state aid is just under $8 million. So that gives us a total revenue of $70,187,000 that we have available to us without having to pass any overrides to cover our overall budgets. Let me walk through the cost side of that now. So if we take a look at those first three categories of non-discretionary spending that I talked about at the beginning, the fixed expenditures that I talked about, and just this chart will show you what goes into that number. There are some fixed expenditures that I talked about that are the things that we have to pay back to the state. From the way that we build the budget and account for things, in our case here, we've included the water and sewer budgets as a fixed expenditure. And the reason for that is because they're contributing on the income side as well. Fixed expenditures about $3.3 million. The town school employee benefits are about $8.4 million. And debt service is about $6.2 million. If I then go to the semi-discretionary, we get to the capital budgets, which are in for $2.57 million. And I'd point out there that in order to get to a budget that did not require a Prop 2.5 override, the decision was made to freeze all capital spending outside of the capital spending that's covered under the Building Stabilization Fund, except for capital spending by the fire department that's being funded out of the ALS revolving fund, and capital spending that's being funded out of the enterprise fund. So a lot of the vehicle spending and equipment spending that you might normally see on our capital budget this year's not there. We recognize that that's not there and that we have something we're going to have to do next year, but that's how we get to that number. And then we have a couple of special articles that have money associated with them. Total amount for that is $815,000. That's made up of $425,000 going to the OPEB fund, the trust fund, $150,000 being requested to fund the State Hospital Development Committee's efforts, and that actually breaks down into about a third going to continued environmental monitoring on the part of the town for the remaining part of the hospital site that the state is still involved in cleaning up. We don't actually own a piece of it over near where the dry cleaning plant is, and what we're doing is independently monitoring the state's efforts to clean that site up to make sure they do it right. And about 2/3 of that will be funding the development committee to do the early work that's required to move forward with getting to a zoning change request that we think you will have an opportunity to vote on at a special town meeting in the fall, if the schedule goes as we have planned, and then ultimately moving into an RFP to take a look at developing the site, assuming that the zoning request gets approved. We have a $90,000 expenditure to repair the dam at Danielson Pond, and then there are some other miscellaneous articles that total out to about $150,000. With that, what we have left is what we call the discretionary budgets. And here I want to go back to that chart that I started off with at the beginning that showed these two budgets split out. The structure that I've got here is something that I developed in the course of putting the information sessions together for last year's sessions before the election to confirm the overrides. But after that, I'd done that, and after we'd had those sessions, I had someone introduce me to an approach that towns use, some other towns have used, to try to maintain discipline over the money that's allocated to the town operating budget and the school operating budget. I've been told informally that it's oftentimes referred to as the Lexington model. There are a number of towns here in the area that are using it, including Millis right next door to us. What it boils down to is, after taking all those things out, the non-discretionary funding, those other semi-discretionary funding requirements, what's left in terms of revenues available that would not require a Prop 2.5 override then is split in a pre-specified split between the town budget and the school budget. So sticking with that 25% town, 75% split that I showed you on one of those earlier slides, and taking a look at the money that we had allocated to all those other categories, what that did was that left us with an amount of money that allowed us to give 75% of that money, or $36.6 million, to the schools, and 25% of that money, or $12.2 million, to the town. And what you'll see is what the town and the schools actually came in with was effectively those two numbers. The town came in slightly under their target. The schools came in slightly over their target. But between those two, we basically nets out to where we were able to avoid a Prop 2.5 operating override vote. So that's pretty much how the budget is shaping up. I did have a question and answer session planned for this, but I don't think we're going to do that. What I'm hoping is that this brief discussion or brief explanation of the budget will help you as you prepare for Monday night's meeting to at least understand at the macro level how the budget is structured, why the budget is what it is, and as you look at the details that are in the warrant report, this may help you to better analyze even the details if you choose to do that. I got a request before this session for us to post this presentation on the town website, which as soon as this session is over, we'll plan to do that. So any of these slides or anything you see here in the presentation that you'd like to be able to spend more time with should be available to you by tomorrow morning at the latest. So with that, I had Mike Pastore and Christine Freerweiler here, thinking that the three of us were going to field the volume of questions that were going to come in with the budget. But given that I know Mike in particular had to juggle taking care of his kids at home and handing them off to his wife just to get here, let me at least offer, if either of you have any, I'm talking because the camera is right up there. So the reason I keep looking up in the sky like that is that's the camera that's got on us. But if either of you would like to make any comments,
Gus, I think you took care of it.
I would just like to remind everybody we have a 2019 annual town meeting page that you can go to get more background information, not only on the budget, but all of the articles that will be presented at town meeting. And I'd be remiss, and Scott would be very angry if I did not announce that town meeting is at 7 p.m. on Monday. We've changed the time.
Yes. And the warrant committee will be meeting at the library at 6:30 before town meeting. And certainly, as always, anyone's welcome to come and join us, and look forward to seeing everyone at 7 o'clock.
So I'd like to thank the two members in the audience that are here for coming and listening through this. And I'd like to thank all of you who I hope are out there listening to this. Appreciate you tuning in. Go Bruins!
Medfield TV. Community shows.